Hey y'all, this is Dr. Nicole Richter, and this is a video in a continuing series in which I read out loud important philosophical texts related to the philosophy of film. And today we'll be reading one of my favorites, which is the Ontology of the Photographic Image. And one of the reasons it's my favorites is because it's written by André Bazin, who is such a foundational and important thinker in the history of film studies, and he was one of the earliest thinkers to really try to apply philosophy to film, as well as the essay really highlighting one of the, I think, best metaphors for what cinema is. Because when we're talking about the ontology of the photographic image, we're really asking, what is film? What is cinema? What is cinema itself? So this essay is by André Bazin, and it's translated by Hugh Gray. So there'll be a little bit of front matter where Hugh Gray will give a short overview of André Bazin, and then I will read the essay. Okay, The Ontology of the Photographic Image by André Bazin, translated by Hugh Gray. Before his untimely death in 1958, André Bazin began to review and select for publication his post-World War II writings on the cinema. Of the planned 4 volumes, one was published in 1958 and a second in 1959. The remainder awaits some competent selective hand. The first volume centers on the theme of the ontological basis of cinema, or, as Bazin also puts it in less philosophical terms, the cinema as the art of reality. The second discusses the relations between the cinema and those arts with which it has things in common, the theater, the novel, and painting. A third volume was to have discussed the relations of cinema and society. The fourth would have dealt with neorealism. What follows is a translation of the first chapter of Volume 1. To those not yet familiar with the writings of a man who might be described with justice as a saint of film criticism, it should serve to reveal the informed clarity and perceptiveness of his mind, shining through the inevitable awkwardnesses and compressions of writing under pressure as a journalist. It is difficult to estimate fully as yet the loss to the cinema of a man who was counselor as well as critic. And here's the essay. If the plastic arts were put under psychoanalysis, the practice of embalming the dead might turn out to be a fundamental factor in their creation. The process might reveal that at the origin of painting and sculpture, there lies a mummy complex. The religion of ancient Egypt, aimed against death, saw survival as depending on the continued existence of the corporeal body. Thus, by providing a defense against the passage of time, it set aside a basic psychological need in man, for death is but the victory of time. To preserve artificially his bodily appearance is to snatch it from the flow of time, to stow it away neatly, so to speak, in the hold of life. It was natural, therefore, to keep up appearances in the face of the reality of death by preserving flesh and bone. The first Egyptian statue then was a mummy, tanned and petrified in sodium, but pyramids and labyrinth corridors offered no certain guarantee against ultimate pillage. Other forms of insurance were therefore sought. So, near the sarcophagus, alongside the corn that was to feed the dead, the Egyptians placed terracotta statuettes as substitute mummies, which might replace the bodies if these were destroyed. It is this religious use, then, that lays bare the primordial function of statuary, namely the preservation of life by a representation of life. Another manifestation of the same kind of thing is the arrow-pierced clay bare to be found in prehistoric caves, a magic identity substitute for the living animal that will ensure a successful hunt. The evolution side by side of art and civilization has relieved the plastic arts of their magic role. Louis XIV did not have himself embalmed. He was content to survive in his portrait by Lebrun. Civilization cannot, however, entirely cast out time. It can only sublimate our concern with it to the level of rational thinking. No one believes any longer in the ontological identity of model and image, but all are agreed that the image helps us to remember the subject and to preserve him for a second spiritual death. And I'll note there that there is gendered language in this article, and I'm reading it as it is originally written, but please be aware that I do not endorse the gendered language here. Today, the making of images no longer shares an anthropocentric utilitarian purpose. It is no longer a question of survival after death, but of a larger concept, the creation of an ideal world in the likeness of the real, with its own temporal destiny. How vain a thing is painting, if underneath our fond admiration for its works, we do not discern man's primitive need to have the last word in the argument with death by means of the form that endures. If the history of the plastic arts is less a matter of their aesthetic than of their psychology, then it will be seen to be essentially the story of resemblance, or, if you will, of realism. Seen in this sociological perspective, photography and cinema would provide a natural explanation for the great spiritual and technical crisis that overtook modern painting around the middle of the last century. André Malraux has described the cinema as the furthermost evolution to date of plastic realism, the beginnings of which were manifest at the Renaissance and which found a limited expression in Baroque painting. It is true that painting the world over has struck a varied balance between the symbolic and realism. However, in the 15th century, Western painting began to turn from its age-old concern with spiritual realities expressed in the form proper to it towards an effort to combine this spiritual expression with a complete and initiation as possible of the outside world. The decisive moment undoubtedly came with the discovery of the first scientific and already, in a sense, mechanical system of reproduction, namely perspective. The camera obscura of Da Vinci foreshadowed the camera that came out. The artist was now in a position to create the illusion of three-dimensional space within which things appeared to exist as our eyes in reality see them. Thenceforth, painting was torn between two ambitions, one primarily aesthetic, namely the expression of spiritual reality, wherein the symbol transcended its model. The other, purely psychological, namely to duplicate the world outside. The satisfaction of this appetite for illusion merely served to increase it till, bit by bit, it consumed the plastic arts. However, since perspective had only solved the problem of form and not of movement, realism was forced to continue the search for some way of giving dramatic expression to the moment, a kind of psychic fourth dimension that could suggest life in the tortured immobility of Baroque art. The great artists, of course, have always been able to combine the two tendencies. They have allotted to each its proper place in the hierarchy of things, holding reality at their command and molding it at will into the fabric of their art. Nevertheless, the fact remains that we are faced with two essentially different phenomena, and these any objective critic must view separately if he is to understand the evolution of the pictorial. The need for illusion has not ceased to trouble the heart of painting since the 16th century. It is a purely mental need, of itself non-aesthetic, the origins of which must be sought in the proclivity of the mind towards magic. However, it is a need the pull of which has been strong enough to have seriously upset the equilibrium of the plastic arts. The quarrel over realism in art stems from a misunderstanding, from a confusion between the aesthetic and the psychological, between true realism, the need that it is to give significant expression to the world both concretely and in its essence, and the pseudo-realism of a deception aimed at fooling the eye or, for that matter, the mind. a pseudo-realism content, in other words, with illusory appearances. That is why medieval art never passed through this crisis. Simultaneously vividly realistic and highly spiritual, it knew nothing of the drama that came to light as a consequence of technical developments. Perspective was the original sin of Western painting. It was redeemed from sin by Lumiere in achieving the aims of Baroque art. Photography has freed the plastic arts from their obsession with likeness. Painting was forced, as it turned out, to offer us illusion, and this illusion was reckoned sufficient onto art. Photography and the cinema, on the other hand, are discoveries that satisfy once and for all, and in its very essence, our obsession with realism. No matter how skillful the painter, his work was always in fee for an inescapable subjectivity. The fact that a human hand intervened cast a shadow of doubt over the image. Again, the essential factor in the transition from the Baroque to photography is not the perfecting of a physical process. Photography will long remain the inferior of painting in the reproduction of color. Rather does it lie in a psychological fact, to wit, in completely satisfying our appetite for illusion by a mechanical reproduction, in the making of which man plays no part. The solution is not to be found in the result achieved, but in the way of achieving it. This is why the conflict between style and likeness is a relatively modern phenomenon, of which there is no trace before the invention of the sensitized plate. Clearly, the fascinating objectivity of Chardin is in no sense that of the photographer. The 19th century saw the real beginnings of the crisis of realism, of which Picasso is now the mythical central figure, and which put to the test at one and the same time the conditions determining the formal existence of the plastic arts and their sociological roots. Freed from the resemblance complex, the modern painter abandons it to the masses, who henceforth identify resemblance on the one hand with photography and on the other with the kind of painting which is related to photography. Originality in photography, as distinct from originality in painting, lies in the essentially objective character of photography. Bazin here makes a point of the fact that the lens, the basis of photography, is in French called the objectif, a nuance that is lost in English. For the first time, between the originating object and its reproduction, there intervenes only the instrumentality of a non-living agent. For the first time, an image of the world is formed automatically, without the creative intervention of man. The personality of the photographer enters into the proceedings only in his selection of the object to be photographed and by way of the purpose he has in mind. Although the final result may reflect something of his personality, this does not play the same role as it played by that of the painter. All the arts are based on the presence of man. Only photography derives an advantage from his absence. Photography affects us like a phenomenon in nature, like a flower or a snowflake, whose vegetable or earthly origins are an inseparable part of their beauty. This production by automatic means has radically affected our psychology of the image. The objective nature of photography confirms on it a quality of credibility absent from all other picture making. In spite of any objections our critical spirit may offer, we are forced to accept as real the existence of the object reproduced, actually represented, set before us, that is to say, in time and space. Photography enjoys a certain advantage in virtue of this transference of reality from the thing to its reproduction. A very faithful drawing may actually tell us more about the model, but despite the promptings of our critical intelligence, it will never have the irrational power of the photograph to bear away our faith. Besides, painting is, after all, an inferior way of making likenesses, the processes of reproduction. Only a photographic lens can give us the kind of image of the object that is capable of satisfying the deep need man has to substitute for it something more than a mere approximation, a kind of decal or transfer. The photographic image is the object itself, the object freed from the conditions of time and space that govern it. No matter how fuzzy, distorted, or discolored, no matter how lacking in documentary value the image may be, it shares, by virtue of the very process of its becoming, the being of the model of which it is the reproduction. It is the model. Hence the charm of family albums. Those gray or sepia shadows, phantom-like and almost undecipherable, are no longer traditional family portraits, but rather the disturbing presence of lives halted at a set moment in their duration, freed from their destiny, not, however, by the prestige of art, but by the power of an impassive mechanical process. For photography does not create eternity as art does. It embalms time, rescuing it simply from its proper corruption. Viewed in this perspective, the cinema is objectivity in time. The film is no longer content to preserve the object, enshrouded as it were in an instant, as the bodies of insects are preserved intact out of the distant past in amber. The film delivers Baroque art from its convulsive catalepsy. Now, for the first time, the image of things is likewise the image of their duration, change mummified, as it were. Those categories of resemblance which determine the species' photographic image likewise, then, determine the character of its aesthetic as distinct from that of painting. The aesthetic qualities of photography are to be sought in its power to lay bare the realities. It is not for me to separate off in the complex fabric of the objective world, here a reflection on a damp sidewalk, there the gesture of a child. Only the impassive lens, stripping its object of all those ways of seeing it, those piled up preconceptions, that spiritual dust and grime with which my eyes have covered it, are able to present it in all its virginal purity to my attention and consequently to my love. By the power of photography, the natural image of a world that we neither know nor can know, nature at last does more than imitate art. She imitates the artist. Photography can even surpass art in creative power. The aesthetic world of the painter is of a different kind from that world of him, from that of the world about him. Its boundaries enclose a substantially and essentially different microcosm. The photograph as such and the object in itself share a common being, after the fashion of a fingerprint. Wherefore, photography actually contributes something to the order of natural creation, instead of providing a substitute for it. The Surrealists had an inkling of this when they looked to the photographic plate to provide them with their monstrosities, and for this reason, the Surrealist does not consider his aesthetic purpose and the mechanical effect of the image on our imaginations as things apart. For him, the logical distinction between what is imaginary and what is real tends to disappear. Every image is to be seen as an object, and every object as an image. Hence, photography ranks high in the order of surrealist creativity because it produces an image that is a reality of nature, namely a hallucination that is also a fact. The fact that surrealist painting combines tricks of visual deception with meticulous attention to detail substantiates this. So, photography is clearly the most important event in the history of the plastic arts, simultaneously a liberation and an accomplishment. It has freed Western painting once and for all from its obsession with realism and allowed it to recover its aesthetic autonomy. Impressionist realism, offering science as an alibi, is at the opposite extreme from eye-deceiving trickery. Only when form ceases to have any imitated value can it be swallowed up in color. So, when form, in the person of Cezanne, once more regains possession of the canvas, there is no longer any question of the illusions of the geometry of perspective. The painting being confronted in the mechanically produced image with a competitor able to reach out beyond Baroque, resemblance to the very identity of the model was compelled into the category of object. Henceforth, Pascal's condemnation of painting is itself rendered vain, since the photograph allows us, on the one hand, to admire in reproduction something that our eyes alone could not have taught us to love, and, on the other, to admire the painting as a thing in itself whose relations to something in nature has ceased to be the justification for its existence. On the other hand, of course, cinema is also a language. Thank you all for listening, and I will see you next time.